They say America fought two governments in the 20th century. One wore suits in Washington, the other silk ties in smoky back rooms. One wrote laws, the other rewrote them in blood, and for decades they pretended not to see each other, until silence cracked and a war began. The FBI called it justice. The mob called it survival. History remembers it as a crusade against crime. But if you peel back the headlines, you'll see something darker. Two empires, mirrors of each other, locked in a struggle to decide who truly ruled America. And the scariest part, the war never really ended. Chapter 1. Hoover's Shadow War. The war between the FBI and the mob did not start with a declaration, a treaty, or even a single gunshot. It began with silence, a silence so deafening it lasted for decades. J. Edgar Hoover, the iron-fisted director of the Bureau from 1924 to 1972, publicly insisted the Mafia didn't even exist. To the average American, this seemed like denial, incompetence, even cowardice. But look closer, and the silence looks more like a strategy, a deal carved in shadows. Hoover was obsessed with communists, radicals, and anyone who challenged the state openly. But the mob made its money quietly, siphoning billions through gambling, racketeering, and narcotics, without challenging the government's authority in the way the Reds did. More disturbing still, Hoover was a man of secrets, a man who collected dossiers on presidents and senators, like other men collected baseball cards. And the mob specialized in secrets too, especially the kind that could ruin reputations. Whispers still linger that Hoover's own vulnerabilities, gambling debts, compromising photographs, hidden preferences he spent his life denying, were held in the hands of Mafia bosses, ensuring his silence. This non-existence of the mob was convenient for everyone. Hoover could parade the FBI as flawless defenders of democracy, and the five families could expand without federal interference. By the 1950s, organized crime was raking in what conservative estimates put at $10 billion annually. An economic powerhouse larger than the budgets of most states. Think about that. While Eisenhower warned of a military-industrial complex, America was already rotting from the inside with a criminal-industrial complex. The mob controlled casinos in Vegas, unions on the docks, heroin pipelines across oceans, and real estate in every major city. And the FBI, the mighty, all-seeing FBI, pretended it wasn't real. It took a Senate investigation, not the Bureau, to break the silence. In 1957, after the infamous Appalachian meeting, where dozens of mob bosses gathered in upstate New York and were caught fleeing through the woods in expensive suits, the world saw the truth. Newspapers splashed headlines. The Mafia exists. The Bureau's great denial was shattered, and Hoover could no longer keep the shadow war off the books. What followed was not just an investigation. It was an outright war. A battle not of armies, but of surveillance, wiretaps, indictments, and assassinations in alleys. And here's the chilling thought. Wars between nations end with treaties, flags, and signatures. Wars between shadow governments, the FBI on one side, the Mafia on the other, never really end. They just change shape. And when the Bureau finally turned its guns toward the five families, America itself would never be the same again. Chapter 2. The Kefauver Revelation. The real turning point, the moment when America's underworld was dragged screaming into daylight, came not from the FBI's brilliance, but from the Senate itself. Estes Kefauver, a Tennessee senator with the looks of a small-town lawyer, but the instincts of a crusader, chaired televised hearings in the early 1950s that electrified the nation. Millions of Americans, gathered around black and white screens, watched mobsters squirm under the bright lights. Frank Costello, one of Luciano's successors, refused to show his face on camera. Only his hands, those twitching, restless hands becoming a national symbol of guilt. For the first time, ordinary citizens saw the scale of organized crime. Not as Hollywood melodrama, but as a cancer eating their unions, their neighborhoods, their politicians. The hearings revealed that mob money had seeped into every pore of America. Judges on payrolls, police captains in mobster pockets, senators funded by gambling kickbacks. Kefauver's report estimated that organized crime had reached into 40 of 48 states, essentially creating a shadow network parallel to the federal government. The public was outraged, terrified, and fascinated. Letters flooded Congress demanding action. Yet the FBI still dragged its feet. Hoover insisted on calling it cosa nostra, only reluctantly, as if naming it gave it too much reality. Some speculate Hoover feared that exposing the Mafia fully would expose the Bureau's own decades of willful blindness, or worse, its covert dealings. But Kefauver's hearings had unleashed a storm that could not be ignored. By the late 1950s, the federal government was forced to pivot. Wiretap technology, previously reserved for spies and traitors, was now aimed at mob bosses. The Bureau built entire task forces, embedding agents in neighborhoods, tracking cash flows, monitoring casinos, infiltrating unions. By the 1960s, under Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the war escalated to open federal prosecution. Kennedy once declared that the mob was the enemy within, more dangerous than any foreign threat. And perhaps he was right. By some estimates, by 1961, the Mafia's grip on America's economy reached nearly 10% of the gross national product. That means 1 in every $10 that moved in America carried the fingerprints of men like Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, or Joe Bonanno. The FBI had waited decades, but now it was hunting a monster that had grown too big to cage quietly. This was no longer about gamblers and thugs. It was about who really governed America. And the terrifying truth is that when the FBI went to war with the Mafia, they weren't just dismantling criminal networks. They were dismantling an alternative government that had already embedded itself into the bones of the nation. Chapter 3. The Birth of RICO, a New Weapon. By the late 1960s, the FBI found itself playing whack-a-mole with a hydra. Every time they cut down a mobster, another one rose to take his place. Wiretaps caught conversations, indictments jailed capos. But the families didn't collapse. They adapted. Killing one boss was like killing a general. The commission had built redundancies, a system where power shifted like water, flowing to the next soldier without hesitation. The Bureau needed something different, something systemic. Enter the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO signed into law in 1970. On paper, it was a dry piece of legislation, another statute in the dusty shelves of federal code. In reality, it was the nuclear bomb of legal weapons. For the first time, prosecutors could charge entire organizations, not just individuals, treating the 5 families like the corporations they were. If a soldier shook down a bar owner in Queens, and the money flowed up to the boss could now be indicted for crimes he never touched. This was revolutionary, terrifying to the underworld. Imagine a law that didn't just punish a thief, but bankrupted the entire company he worked for, seizing assets, tearing apart unions, confiscating mansions. That was RICO, and the FBI wielded it with merciless precision. By the mid-1970s, mob families were watching their empires dismembered, not with bullets, but with subpoenas. Casinos in Vegas, once skimmed for the mob, were raided. Teamster pension funds, long the mob's golden goose, were frozen under court orders. For the first time in history, it looked like the government had found a blade sharp enough to cut through the commission's armor. But here's the unsettling truth. RICO was not just about the mob. It was a framework that could be aimed at anyone: unions, corporations, activist groups. In fighting the Mafia, the FBI built a weapon that could dismantle entire social structures with the stroke of a pen. And once you invent such a weapon, you never put it back in the box. The mob had been the excuse, but the real legacy of RICO was the government's discovery that it could declare war on any collective body it deemed corrupt. Some conspiracy theorists whisper that Hoover and his successors had always planned it this way, that the Mafia was simply the test case for a future where power could atomize dissent. Whether you believe that or not, the fact remains: RICO changed the rules. The Mafia, which had survived wars, assassinations, even partnerships with the U.S. Navy, suddenly found itself strangled not by rivals but by paperwork, by accountants, by courtrooms where entire families stood trial like corporations in disgrace. And yet, even in the face of this new onslaught, the five families did not die. They adapted again, burrowing deeper, growing quieter, becoming harder to see. The war had entered a new phase. No longer visible gunfights on the streets, but invisible chess moves in boardrooms and courtrooms. And if you think the FBI's victory was certain, you've forgotten what happens when an empire fights for its survival. The Mafia had one last card to play, and it was written in blood. Chapter 4. Blood on the Streets. The mob strikes back. The FBI thought the war would be won with laws, indictments, and trials. But the Mafia was not a paper enemy. It had grown from the streets, from men who understood that violence was a language older than law. In the 1970s and 80s, as RICO cases mounted and FBI wiretaps spread like wildfire, the mob retaliated with its oldest weapon, fear. Judges assigned to mob cases found themselves stalked. Prosecutors received death threats, not whispered in alleys, but shouted in phone calls at midnight. And when threats didn't work, blood followed. In 1985, U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani unveiled the Commission case, a sweeping prosecution that aimed to dismantle the very skeleton Luciano had built half a century earlier. It was the most ambitious assault the government had ever launched. 9 mob bosses indicted, the entire commission in the crosshairs. But in the streets, bodies piled up. Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino family, was gunned down outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. A murder ordered by his own underboss, John Gotti, who feared Castellano's trial would drag them all under. Witnesses were silenced with bullets, or disappeared into shallow graves. Union leaders, who dared defy mob-backed contracts, were found in trunks, their throats slit. Even FBI agents weren't untouchable. Informants whispered that certain agents who got too close found themselves in mysterious car accidents, or vanished altogether. The war had escalated from investigations to open executions. And here's the terrifying part. The violence wasn't random. It was strategic. Each killing was a message, a punctuation mark in a language of terror. When Castellano's blood pooled on Manhattan pavement, it wasn't just a mob hit. It was a declaration that the Mafia would not go quietly into courtrooms. At the same time, the violence fed the Bureau's case, proving to juries that the 5 families weren't just criminals, but a parallel government willing to use murder as policy. The commission trial in 1986 ended with 11 top leaders sentenced to a combined 100 years in prison. Newspapers proclaimed the mob broken. The FBI declared victory. But beneath the headlines lurked the truth. For every boss jailed, 10 soldiers remained. For every capo silenced, another whispered in his place. The mob had survived Prohibition, survived Hoover, survived deportations and betrayals. Did anyone really believe a courtroom could bury it? The war was far from over. It had only shifted battlefields. And some say that the blood spilled in those years wasn't just vengeance, but ritual. A reminder that the Mafia was not simply a criminal group but a culture, a nation without borders, older than the FBI itself. And cultures, unlike men, do not die in prison. They wait, they adapt, and they rise again when the silence is deepest. Chapter 5. The Infiltrators. If RICO was the legal bomb the FBI dropped on the mob, infiltration was the dagger they slid between its ribs. For decades, the 5 families had thrived because outsiders couldn't get close enough to understand the machinery, its rituals, its codes, its invisible pipelines of power. But in the late 1970s, the Bureau began cultivating agents with the patience, nerve, and cold-blooded commitment to live as criminals for years. The most legendary of them was Joseph Pistone, a man who became Donnie Brasco. For 6 years, Pistone wore the skin of a jewel thief, embedding himself in the Bonanno family until he wasn't just observing them, he was trusted, invited to sit at their tables, privy to secrets men had died to protect. His undercover work led to over 200 indictments and exposed how fragile trust could be when paranoia seeped into the bones of an organization. But Brasco was only the tip of the spear. Across the country, agents wired up strip clubs, sat in union halls, posed as truck drivers, even as hitmen. The mob had always prided itself on its code of silence, omerta, but infiltration shattered that myth. Every handshake could be a trap. Every soldier could be a ghost in disguise. And worse still, when arrests came, it wasn't just faceless FBI agents in suits leading them away. It was the man they had called friend, the man they had trusted with their lives. By the mid-1980s, informants and undercover agents had become the mob's nightmare, more terrifying than rival gunmen, because betrayal from within gnaws deeper than bullets. And yet here lies the cruel irony. Infiltration didn't just destroy the Mafia, it revealed how closely its structure mirrored America itself. Court transcripts read like boardroom minutes. Indictments looked like corporate audits. And surveillance tapes played like strategy meetings from Fortune 500 firms. Some historians argue this was the true horror, uncovered by Donnie Brasco and others. That the Mafia wasn't a distortion of American capitalism, but its reflection. A distorted mirror, yes, but still a mirror. And that left a question lingering in the smoke-filled courtrooms of the 1980s. If the mob could be infiltrated, could it truly be destroyed? Or would it simply dissolve into the very institutions the FBI claimed to defend, becoming invisible, untouchable, eternal? The FBI declared victory in the late 1980s. The commission trial gutted the hierarchy. Undercover agents dismantled trust, and RICO turned bosses into convicts. Headlines screamed, "The mob is dead," but history is a liar when it tries to write endings. The five families still exist, quieter, leaner, less visible, but not gone. Their rackets have shifted: cybercrime, Wall Street scams, international narcotics pipelines. But the structure remains. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The FBI didn't kill the mob. It forced it to evolve. Today, when you swipe a credit card, when you buy a stock, when you watch construction rise in cities, there are whispers. Financial analysts tracing unusual flows of capital. Investigators hinting that mob money still moves through global markets. The war that began in silence under Hoover and erupted in blood under Gotti has not ended. It has simply gone invisible. The FBI versus the mob was never just about criminals versus lawmen. It was about two governments competing for control of America, one draped in the flag, the other in shadows, but both obsessed with power, order, and survival. And maybe that's why it feels so haunting. Because if Luciano built a skeleton that still shapes America, then the FBI, in trying to destroy it, built a new one, a surveillance state, armed with RICO, wiretaps, infiltration, and the authority to dismantle entire worlds. Two empires, locked in a war that changed the country forever. One still whispers in alleys. The other still listens through walls. And you, living your ordinary life, are caught in the middle of their endless dance, whether you know it or not.